Thanks for joining us for today's webinar on the CMMC. This meeting is being recorded, and we ask that you keep yourself on mute unless you're prompted by the presenter. Then you can also use the chat to ask questions at any time, and we will address them as time permits. During this webinar, we're also going to be using the Google Meet poll feature to get some audience feedback during the presentation. Now, you can find the polls, if you're not familiar with Google Meet, in the upper right corner of the Google Meet window. There'll be an activities icon, and that icon is basically like a little triangle, circle, and square. If you click on that, it'll open up the polls as we launch them. So I will prompt you as we go ahead and launch those polls. So this meeting is being hosted by Worsta, and I want to tell you a little bit about us before we get started. As a premier Google Cloud partner focused on collaboration design, it is our mission to help companies maximize their use of the cloud. I wanted to keep that short so that we can go ahead and jump into the meat of the presentation. My name is David Moore. I'm Director of Marketing for Worsta, and your subject matter expert today is Pete Hoff, CMMC-AB Registered Practitioner and Cybersecurity Consultant for Worsta. I'm now going to pass it over to Pete to get us started.
Hi, everyone. My background in security, I've been all over the place. You know, CMMC is a new certification. So it's new to me. It's new to everybody in the industry. But I've got about 20 years behind me in information security as a CISSP, and worked in numerous regulations over the years. And my first real experience with DoD was working for them in the Air Force. So I know a little bit about how to deal with the government, hurry up and wait. That's kind of the status we're in right now for the CMMC certification. We'll hop right into the agenda. Dave, I don't know if you want to cover the agenda real quick, and then we'll...
Yeah. Well, we got through introductions. We're going to start off by basically telling you what the CMMC is, and why is it there, and then talk a little bit about who needs CMMC and kind of what levels you need to be certified at. Move on to who can help you become certified, and the timeline that you need to take in order to make sure that you're certified by the time this becomes a requirement, so you don't miss out on any contracts or anything like that. And then finally, how can Worsta help and what next steps you should take.
Outstanding. We'll start off on defining CMMC. You're probably going to hear this till you're tired of it for the rest of your life now. The DoD is implementing the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification as part of their contract requirement. So it's not necessarily new in terms of needing to meet certain cybersecurity requirements. They've had some requirements in place for a number of years. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. But timelines to award a contract this year are starting to get a little tight. And by 2026, all of our contracts that we will award from the DoD, I speak we, it's actually, I'm not part of the DoD, but all contracts will have to be met with a CMMC certification. There's a couple small exceptions, but for the most part, if you're here, I'm thinking that you're probably going to be going after some of those DoD contracts, and you may see the requirement listed when you apply. So let's hop to the next slide. So the CMMC is an umbrella standard, meaning that in the past, we had 15 requirements from the Federal Defense Acquisition Requirements document. You see it listed there, very official name. The reality is that vendors were asked to meet certain cybersecurity requirements, and those were things like protecting the information regarding your contract with the federal government, How do you protect that information? Depends on a number of factors, but there were 15 requirements listed under DFAR 52.204-19, 20, and 21. Out of those requirements, most vendors, I think, it made an attempt, but there were some real challenges. And I think that as cybersecurity changes and we see more nation state type attacks occurring these days, the federal government felt, let's expand this. And they focused on the National Institute of Standards and Technology standards, 800-171. It's a great set of controls that's been out there for quite a while. They augmented the DFAR with those 110 requirements from NIST, and that's what came out as the new umbrella standard. Go ahead and hop to the next slide for me. So if you think about NIST and DFARs, this is this is really kind of just a little eye candy, but the reality is you first begin with the DFAR standards, the 15 requirements. In a maturity model, CMMC maturity level 1, you only need to meet those first 15 requirements. And a few of the NIST requirements, there's just a short list. We'll go over those shortly. In a CMMC maturity level 3, you're going to meet a lot more. So that's where the larger brunt of the NIST 110 controls comes into play. We can hop to the next slide. Thanks.
And we got our first polling question. And folks, once again, you'll see the activities area in your Google Meet window in the upper right corner. It's the triangle, square, circle icon. And I'm going to launch a poll, just asking if you've seen any requests for CMMC on any of your new contract submissions. So give us just a few moments. We're just trying to get a temperature check of the room to inform the conversation. So it looks like a pretty even split so far on it of folks that have seen it, but we definitely, it looks like folks are seeing this. Several people have already seen it, but most, it looks like, maybe haven't yet. So I'll end the poll. Yeah, out of the 22 votes, about 10 people said that they have not seen it, but 8 said yes. So it seems like a pretty good split.
All right. Well, so obviously this is going to continue to be a part of daily life going forward. I mock it a little bit, but there's a life cycle to cybersecurity, and it's just one big round circle, and we just keep going around and around and around until we quit doing what we do. You never get away from it. So let's move on to the next slide. We thought of some analogies here, and these things come into play when trying to define what the maturity levels are and how you might have to meet requirements regardless of the level of your contract. I start out with, there's two types of data that they're concerned with: the controlled unclassified information and the federal contract information. Federal contract information, as many of you may already know, is the data that's associated with your contract. So when you enter into a contract with the DoD, provide them a service, that contract itself is considered FCI. Now, during the process of expanding the requirements of that contract, sometimes there are requirements that require you to come into contact with controlled unclassified information, or as a result of your contract, you may actually produce CUI. So that's where the levels come in from a maturity level 1 or 3 perspective. Level 1 generally will only come into contact with FCI. Level 3 has controlled unclassified information. There's a couple caveats to this. If you're selling the government commercial off-the-shelf products, there's a CMMC compliance exception there. If that's the case, It's not a big deal. You could talk to us and we could provide you some additional information, but just know that you might not have to get CMMC certified if you're just selling off-the-shelf products to the government. Let's move right on. So why is this required? I'm going to go to our analogies here. First and foremost, if you recall, I talked about federal FCI information. Under that heading, you may or may not come into contact with something like a vendor that sells toilet paper to the DoD. The example that I can give you why this becomes important is I might have a military base in the middle of Europe that I'm shipping 50,000 rolls of toilet paper to every month. And for some reason, I have to increase that purchase to 200,000. Now, it's still only toilet paper, doesn't change the content of what's being delivered, but the volume implies that you might be sending troops there to that location, or there may be support personnel or other reasons why they require additional toilet paper. Somebody in a nation state may be interested in that, and they may use that as information to help them understand where we're moving things or what we're doing with the federal government. We want to protect that information, and that's why the toilet paper example is actually great. I think it helps people understand why we protect FCI. Just your contract alone is really important. So, types of information needing protection. Let's see. Let's go back to why is this required. Still have a couple things to cover there. So as we've seen an increase in ransomware and other types of phishing attacks, the federal government has seen attacks that have impacted both the security and safety of the DoD and, of course, Americans that help protect us. So unfortunately, having that self-certify model that they've provided, the DFARS model, it was not being met very well. And unfortunately, DoD saw that they had to become more forceful with trying to get this certification. It's not optional, it's a requirement. And it's to make sure that we don't see these types of issues occur, like the ransomware attacks and phishing attacks and loss of confidential and sensitive information. And as you know, more recently, the cyber attacks by foreign governments. I don't know if you've seen Kevin Mandia's report from FireEye. He's spoken to specifically what's happening with nation state attacks. China has been identified as the attackers that attacked Exchange servers, Microsoft Exchange. Unfortunately, organizations carry these legacy applications. I call it legacy because not many people have an Exchange server in their house any longer, but they've moved to the cloud. But there's over 100,000 servers that have been impacted that they're aware of. And many of these could be DoD contractors. And if you weren't protecting things properly, those cyber attacks could walk away with important email information from your Exchange servers and so on. These things are going to continue. And right now, I sat through an FBI discussion last night, InfoGuard, and their comments were that right now terrorism is number 2. Nation state cyber attacks are the number 1 concern of the FBI. So take that under advisement. You know that you're going to become a target. It's not if, it's when. And having this CMMC certification is really meant to protect our country and your business and all the people that work within those areas. Let's go to the next slide. Types of information needing protection. You saw this FCI, controlled unclassified information. But I want to make one point here. There's been a conversation around contracts that vendors create with the DoD. These contracts You have your best lawyers jump in there and try to protect the company so that they have the least amount of requirements and place risk where it needs to be. There's something called the Christian doctrine. And if you haven't heard of it, it basically states for DoD contracts that if you do not follow the DFARS requirements and the CMMC certification requirements to secure your cybersecurity, you can be fined. There has been thousands of fines issued every year for companies that are not protecting DoD information or contracts. And the Christian doctrine is used to stick companies with that fine. Unfortunately, Christian doctrine states that it doesn't matter what contract language you have to be cyber secure. And that's the bottom line. There is no get out of jail clause in any contract. Let's move on.
Our next poll, are you guys familiar with the certification bodies? I'll launch that poll right now. Once again, go to the activities section in the upper right corner of the Google Meet screen to find that, the little triangle, circle, square icon. And we'll give it a minute or two here for the votes to roll in. Great. So it looks like, once again, a pretty even split. Some folks are, some folks aren't. Out of the, gotten about 20 votes in, so I'll end the poll now. Yeah, it's a 50-50 split. So,
well, I'll cover a number of the bodies. You'll start to understand what the structure has been set up to achieve. They were very thoughtful. The DoD said they didn't want to have anything to do with the certification. They wanted it to be independent. So a few years back, they established a body called the CMMC-AB. That's the Cybersecurity Maturity Model accreditation body. And the CMMC-AB is actually the group that does all the planning, all the coordination. They're the ones that issue your certification. So when you finally get certified, you'll get something from the CMMC-AB after it's gone through the assessment review process and QA and all that kind of stuff. There is a third party assessment organization called the C3PAO. The C3PAO is the group that does the assessment itself. Now they have certified assessors and they have certified practitioners, and these certified assessors are the only ones that can do an assessment for you. Practitioners, such as myself, I'm certified to be able to do an assessment of an organization for the purposes of preparing for an assessment. I basically create a gap assessment for you and can help you identify where you might have gaps. I'm also there during the time that you go through your certification in case there's questions from the assessors to help usher you through that process. So as you can guess, there's a real delineated difference between an assessor and a practitioner. If an assessor assists you in preparing, they cannot assess you for the final certification. And practitioners are not authorized to assess you for final certifications either. Hopefully that's about as clear as mud. The groups themselves are independent. And when you conduct an assessment, you can be rest assured that the people that are involved in that organization have gone through pretty stringent training. There is a third group here, which I won't talk about much, but there's a training organization that sets up all the training and content for the assessors, and they train us. But that's an independent group from the C3PAOs. Let's go ahead and move on. So requirements for DoD. This is where the rubber hits the road. There's some really important things here. DoD contractors should immediately learn about the CMMC technical requirements. and start preparing now. I cannot emphasize this more. There's a long-term cybersecurity payout for this. At the end of any assessment process, the assessor is going to prove through multiple pieces of evidence and through an assessment process, both visually on site and depending on the level of maturity and other aspects, that you meet those requirements. And I can give you an example. Under the 15 safeguards, there's something called access control. Access control is also a NIST standard. Access control requires that you approve the access of every individual that has access to any type of data, and that you tracked that request in some way. It doesn't have to be documented for a maturity level 1 assessor, but it does have to be documented that you actually went through the steps of an access control request. So to be quite clear, under a CMMC maturity level 1 situation, even access control is requiring a number of pieces of data. It's at least 2 to prove that you managed your access control for all of your users. And that data needs to go back a year. So if you were to think that maybe, well, I've got access control procedures and I only let authorized people into my network to see this data, it's more than that. It comes down to, can you prove it? And that's why we emphasize you really should start looking at this now. You need at least 1 year of supporting evidence that you're following these controls. And to do that, you probably need a gap assessment and get ahead of this stuff and figure out where you might need to address all the controls. Give you an idea of kind of the timeline that's occurred here. DFARS was back in 2016. I think it was actually 2015, but they established that clause back then. In 2020, they figured out, well, we really do need to have a certification model because just asking for self-certification isn't working. They initiated the accreditation body and started training people. 2021, there's quite a few of us trained, I think around 1,500. And there's a accreditation website that goes over all of the individuals that are certified. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I can help you prepare for this, the reality is people don't have to be certified to help you prepare. But if you really want to know if they know what they're talking about, go out and check their certification. See if they're listed on the site as being a certified assessor or a certified practitioner. You can find my information out there as well. Let's go ahead and move on.
And that brings us to our final poll. Are you aware of the certification levels? I will launch that right now. And I'll hold off on voting for this one because as someone that's been through the presentation, I am. It's looking like the majority of folks do have at least some knowledge of the certification levels, Pete.
Okay, good. So I want to get into a little bit of detail around maturity levels. So under maturity level 1, that's the lowest level, and the DoD expects probably 75 to 80% of all contractors to only need to be a level 1. Under this control level, you have 15 controls. That means basically 15 security standards that you have to meet underneath level 1. And these are under access control, media protection, physical protection. Things under physical protection, for example, is do you have locks on your doors and do you lock your contracts in a file cabinet? That's a real simple way to put this. Access control, do you only allow users that are authorized? You might have somebody that's a janitor that works in your building. That person probably doesn't need access to your contract information. They shouldn't be granted access, even though they're an employee. So, having those controls in place are important at this level. Now, the caveat for maturity level 1 is that you don't actually have to have documented policies. This might kind of blow your mind a little bit. It blew mine when I originally saw it, because I think it'd be really hard if you didn't know what your standard was and you weren't communicating that to your teams. But some businesses are very small, and they have very tight-knit communications, and they all understand what their security controls should be. With that said, if you were going without any kind of documented policies and you were doing this ad hoc, you hire a new employee, they come in, Joe sets up the user in your system. Maybe it's Google email and Google Drive. You lock down their access, and you email the hiring manager, which might be the president, and say, hey, created the user. The president says, great, thank you, that's your approval. And those types of things have to be documented. They might be documented in email, and that's fine. But if these users just appear and there's no supporting documentation behind it, you're not going to pass that level 1 security assessment. Under level 3, there's the 110 controls, which get a little more in depth. I'll give you an example. Under access control, there's an assumption that your network is secure. And what that might mean is, let's say you had a router and a network switch and maybe a firewall sitting in a closet somewhere. Were those devices physically secured, and were all the ports locked down on those devices? If the door was left open, because like in many companies, I walk into their phone closets and they're wide open, and it's really hot because they didn't have AC ducts feeding air there. I'd like to take a poll and see how many people have that problem. And that exposes the network switch and the router and the firewall to anybody walking into that room. And are those ports on that switch locked down? Could I plug in a laptop and walk away, or a USB stick that's got network access, and then infiltrate your network? Those are access control requirements that you'd get into kind of the nitty gritty. It has to be a documented policy, and it has to be in practice and be proven in practice. And that's where under a level 3, someone comes in and prepares you and makes sure that you have all of those standards in place. From that perspective, level 3 is a little more arduous, and the practices that come around that are much greater. I should mention, by the way, on a level 3, the 2 practices that are mentioned is that you have documented policies, okay? Policies and procedures. So you've got to have that policy and procedure manual, and you need a program. What that means is you need to have money and people allocated to a cybersecurity program. And there's a whole lot of things that go with that. Normally you establish a mission, and you're supported by the board or some executive team within the organization. And there's a lot of things that go into a level 3 security program, but they're much different. Level 1 is simpler, but don't underestimate your requirements there. Let's go ahead and jump on to the next one. So what does it look like to do an assessment? It's a little timely that we have this conversation now, because you've got some time. Most of you probably do. But to prepare for a CMMC assessment, whether it's you that does this or whether you hire someone to come in, I would strongly suggest you pull those DFARS standards, those first 15 standards, and begin there. Do a gap assessment. Go through your network. Make sure when you start to assume that access control is just users, expand that mindset and think about whatever you have in your network. It needs to be controlled from an access perspective. That includes your network switches, your firewalls, your routers, all of your endpoints, who has access to these devices and systems, and do you have supporting evidence that it's all secured? Is that phone closet locked? Do that gap assessment, and once you're done, you'll see where you might have some gaps. At that point, you can contact a C3 PAO. You can contact them anytime you want. They can actually do your pre-gap analysis and your assessment, but it'll be different personnel in that organization. Typically, an assessment takes around 6 weeks to 3 months to complete. That's your initial gap assessment. And then to conduct the actual certification, it's anywhere between 3 and 6 months, depending on level 1 or level 3. I see we have a question for level 2. I'll address that right now. Great question, Brent. Under level 2, it's used as a transitionary maturity level. It's not actually used as a certification model. You can assess at level 2, but unfortunately, none of the DoD contracts will actually request that you be a level 2. It's used as a moderate in between level 1 and 3, and it shows the DoD that you're in the process of trying to attempt a level 3. If you successfully do a 2, you're most of the way into a 3. We actually talked about this multiple times in some of our training, and we get together on a monthly basis, and it's very useful for organizations that think they might need it down the road. So let's say you're a certified level 1, and you think you might want to start expanding your business. You could start on a level 2, and it'll allow you to ramp up the processes because it's a pretty intense process. There are a total of 17 domains. That's correct. Those domains are security domains, and they're put together from NIST and the the federal requirements. But if we go back to an earlier slide, the DFARS, go back to slide 17.
Okay.
Under slide 17, there are 15 controls, and those are specifically DFARS. Under level 3, there's 110 controls added on top of that. These are controls and not necessarily domains. If you take a look at the right side, you see how there's 110 controls and 2 practices, and each of those areas, access control, incident response, those are domains under the NIST standards. So that's for level 3. I hope that answers your question. The real easy way to get to this, guys, if anybody here wants to go out and take a look at this, NIST has the cybersecurity standard. The cybersecurity standard is not necessarily exactly 800-171, but it's a great standard to begin with understanding if you're going to be a maturity level 1. You can also go out and look at 800-171 on the National Institute of Standards and Technology website. Probably should have put it out there as a URL so you guys can pull this up. I'll do that in a second here, but I think that covers that a little bit. I know we're kind of jumping into questions here. Essentially, the process to complete your certification, by the way, let's go to the next slide. I'll close this one out. It's about a 9-month period to go through a pre-gap analysis and then finishing your certification if you already have your controls in place. Just remember, if there's things missing, you'll have to document it. Please keep in mind, there are scenarios where you might not do all of the things that are required for a control. A lower set of processes. I'll give you an example. Maybe you didn't use semantic antivirus on your endpoints, on your laptops. You used the default Bitdefender by Microsoft, and you didn't manage it. But Bitdefender would meet the standard for virus protection under, I don't recall the exact control domain, but the point is, let's say that you weren't monitoring your USB ports and allowed people to plug in anything to a laptop. So that's insecure. You could modify that and document that you modified it, and you'd still pass that control, but it has to be documented, and it has to show that you identified the problem and then resolved it and can prove that it's met the requirements. So that covers everything here. The main point here I'd like to make is, WRSTA conducts readiness assessments. We do gap analysis. And there's two forms of objective evidence that's required. If you have someone in-house that's really analytical and understands how this process works, and maybe has some risk and compliance background, then I certainly think that you could probably try this. But if you go the 90 yards and then go for your assessment and you have gaps, it's going to be a much harder conversation with management as to why you didn't get that contract because you didn't get your certification. So I strongly suggest that there's a process well thought out to go through and do a gap assessment at the very minimum. So I think we'll switch over to questions. I know
before we did get started on that, I did want to offer anybody that's on the call today, thanks for attending, and as a bonus for attending and sticking with us through this presentation, we'd like to offer folks a free 30-minute consultation to discuss, kind of where they're at with this and answer any questions that you guys might have. We will be reaching out post-webinar. Your WRSTA rep will be contacting you to see if you're interested in this and schedule it for you next week. If you are interested, feel free to email us at info@wrsta.com right away, and we can get that scheduled. But with that, yeah, let's jump into some Q&A. We've got a lot of great questions, Pete. I'll kind of let you take it and run down from where you'd like to start.
Yeah, well, I'll hit the chat. And the first question I have that we haven't answered yet is a large factory, which includes many offices in the factory, which have network equipment, fiber-connected IDF, wall-mounted for those areas, not in enclosures, and the offices are not locked at all times. How could we become compliant? Could we install a locking enclosure? Yes. Your simple answer is yes. I would always recommend that anytime you have equipment that is network or any type of device that routes traffic, whatever it is, make sure you have a locking cabinet. As a secondary control, I'd always recommend that you disable the ports that aren't required. And from a configuration perspective, you'll find that usually covers what you need. If someone decided to unplug an existing connection, you'd certainly be alerted to the fact that your network isn't working.
Kathy had a question about the process to get FedRAMP moderate validated, not authorized. They're in the process of getting FedRAMP moderate validated. Do they still need CMMC?
Yes, you do. That question came up. They are going to grandfather people in periodically, but it's not going to go away. They're going to transition from validation to CMMC certification. Good question.
Thanks.
We had anything in level 3 that is not a NIST 800-171 requirement. Yes, level 3. So they're the 15 DFARS requirements that are in level 1. And those DFAR requirements can be found on the DoD website for vendors. They're cybersecurity requirements. And of course, if you wanted to talk about it, we could certainly get in more detail there too.
Pete, what are your thoughts on ISO 27001 as part of the solution for CMMC?
So I'll give you my 2 cents to this, because we're discussing American standards U.S. standards, which follow the NIST standard. I can tell you flat out, I have mappings for compliance to ISO standards. So if for some reason you followed ISO 27001, 2005, for example, we could map those back to the NIST controls and you would pass that. It's a little bit of work for us to make sure that we cover all the aspects. ISO is a great standard, and frankly, I would have liked for CMMC to link the two so that it's a little easier to correlate for US-based companies that maybe they have a headquarters in the EU, but we could certainly bridge that gap.
But I want to say just a huge thanks to Pete for all this great information and for everybody for joining and hanging out with us today. Please, once again, if you have questions, info@worsta.com. We'll get it to our team and we will respond very quickly.